So today we're going to talk about how you can tell the quality of Japanese tea so you don't get scammed. Hi, I'm Yuki. I'm the founder of Tealife, and in this channel we break down Japanese tea to make your next cup of tea more fun. And today we're going to talk about two things. One is what's the single most important determiner of quality in Japanese tea? And the second one is how can you tell the quality of Japanese tea even before you drink it? So let's get right into it. Let me start off by asking whether you had the experience of maybe buying a matcha at a shop and tasting it and wondering whether it's the quality you expected. So it's pretty expensive these days, but I'm not sure if I like the taste or not. Was it worth the price I paid? Or maybe you bought a sencha, which was more expensive than the sencha you bought previously, and when you tasted it, you thought, oh, maybe the previous sencha, which was cheaper, I feel that maybe that one was better. So you're not sure if it's like a taste preference or if it's actually a difference in the quality of the Japanese tea. So these are common questions that you might get. Now the good thing about Japanese tea is that, as is several things about Japanese culture, it's relatively simple. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's relatively simple in that there's only one true determiner of quality in Japanese tea, which is umami. So basically, if you have higher umami, the higher the price, the higher the quality of that tea. And if it's like a lower umami, the lower the price and the lower the quality of that tea. And it's really just that simple. I'd say 70%, 80%, even more maybe, of the price is determined by that one parameter of umami alone. Now, this in itself is very interesting, is very unique to Japan because it's very different from other tea cultures where maybe the aroma or the scent or the smell, these all come into the factor of the quality. If you compare it to like a Chinese tea, the difference is very stark. In Chinese tea, as you probably know, there's lots of different parameters that they really tool around with to get really different diverse flavors and ways to enjoy the tea. So for example, they switch around the oxidation of the tea. And oxidation, of course, means things changing with oxygen. So if a banana turns brown, that's oxidation. Avocado turns brown, that's also oxidation. In Chinese tea, you kind of tinker with that oxidation to get different flavors of the tea. So you have green tea, which is not oxidized. You have yellow tea that's a little bit oxidized. You have oolong tea, which is half oxidized, and black tea, or red tea as they call it, which is completely oxidized in Chinese culture. We also have post-fermentation, aging, like in pu'er tea. And you also have scented tea, so like jasmine tea, rose tea, osmanthus tea. You have different parameters of measuring the quality of taste in Chinese tea. But in Japan, because they're singularly focused on the taste of the tea itself, not the scent, not the smell, the taste of the tea itself. That's why umami is the single most important determiner of quality in Japanese tea. Now, of course, there's exceptions to the rules. So, for example, there's different cultivars in tea, and some of the cultivars might be low yield, hard to grow. Those are expensive. And sometimes you might see price tags that are a little bit higher than the level of umami it may demand, right? Other cases might be like in a national tea competition of Japan, where the different tea competitors would be kind of fighting for the top position in Japan. And in this case, it's not just the taste that they determine the tea with, there's other parameters, such as the color of the water, the color of the tea leaves, the shape of the tea leaves, others as well. So, and basically, if you win in this competition, the higher you score in this competition, the higher the price of the tea will be as well. So, I'm not saying that 100% of the price will be determined by just the umami, but what I'm saying is that for 70%, 80%, maybe even more, especially for the teas that we drink on a normal basis, umami will be by far the most important determiner of the quality of Japanese tea. If you buy a matcha and if you taste it and if you think, well, I'm not sure about the taste, but the umami seems to be very high, then it probably means that you probably got a very, very good matcha, and you might not like the notes, but still, it was probably worth the price. Now, after hearing this, you might be asking, but Yuki, I think there's other components that contribute to the quality of Japanese tea, like astringency. If there's a high astringency, that would probably mean that it's a lower quality tea. Now, if you thought that, that's very good. That's a very astute question, and you're actually very correct. But the thing is, in this video, we're not talking about astringency because in Japanese tea, very interestingly, high umami and low astringency are the same thing. And high astringency and low umami are also basically the same thing. And that's why in this video, we're just talking about one side of the equation. Now, there's a very scientific reason why they're the same thing, and we'll talk about this in maybe a future video. But for now, the main determiner of quality of Japanese tea remains umami. So now you'll understand that umami is the single most important determiner of the quality of the Japanese tea. You got that one. But now you might be asking, okay, but when I actually buy the tea, I can't really taste it. So how can you tell the umami before tasting the tea? Because, that's how you want to buy the tea, right? Which is also a very good question. There are indicators that can help you kind of guess the quality or the level of umami in a Japanese tea. That's basically how it works. And there's lots of these indicators, but today we'll go over maybe the four most reliable, important indicators. Okay. The first one is first flush. The first flush green tea is way higher in umami compared to the second or the third. What the first flush tea leaves are is it's the first harvest of the year. So it usually happens in May, June, depending on the area. But the tea leaves, they go through the annual cycle of shedding all the tea leaves in the fall. They would incubate all their nutrients during the winter, during the cold winter, and then all the accumulated nutrients will come out as leaves in the spring, right? So the first flush tea leaves, they take all the nutrients that were all incubated during the winter, and that's why it has so much nutrients. And it's so high in umami because it's basically the amino acids that they accumulate from the root of the tea plant, and they all use it to create the first flush tea leaves. Now, after the first harvest, the tea leaves will grow more leaves. And when you take those, that's called the second flush. And then the next round is obviously called the third flush. The further the flush goes, the lower the umami will become. Naturally, because they've already used all the nutrients that they accumulated over the winter. You want to make sure that if you want to go for a high quality, high umami Japanese tea, whether it be matcha or sencha, you want to look for the first flush Japanese tea. That's very important. The second indicator is shading. So the more you shade the tea leaves from the sun, the higher the umami it becomes. Now, the more precise way of saying this is the sunlight is actually the destroyer of umami. So you want to protect the tea leaves from the sunlight. And the more you do this, the higher the umami and the higher the quality of the tea it becomes. So you may have heard different types of tea that are shaded. So matcha is a type of tea that is shaded for about 3 to 4 weeks before harvesting. Gokuro is also the same. Kabusecha is another type of tea leaf that is slightly less in terms of how long it's being shaded. But these are tea that, despite the fact that it would be a lot more cumbersome to make, a lot more investment required, a lot less in terms of yield because they're blocking the sunlight, they would still go through this process because it's going to increase the quality of Japanese tea. Now, shading doesn't refer to just those three types of tea leaves. Even for a normal tea like sencha, these days they shade slightly sencha as well to increase the umami and makes a difference. So that might be important. Even if it's not intentionally shaded, there's natural shading. So rather than growing tea leaves in a vast field where they get maximum exposure to the sun. Rather than doing that, if you grow tea leaves in, although it's inefficient from an agricultural perspective, if you grow them in deep mountains where there's mists and lower exposure to sunlight, then you get higher umami. And that's why, certain cases, the area of where the tea leaf is grown matters a lot. The third indicator is whether it's hand-picked or not. Now you might be wondering, whether it's hand-picked or not, why does that matter? So that's a good question. Now, this is similar to the second point that I just mentioned, where the sunlight is basically the enemy to umami. So the idea here is you want to block out as much sunlight. You want to minimize the sunlight as much as possible. And one of the ways to do this is if you pick young leaves, then that has minimum exposure to sunlight, basically. So that's why hand picking is really important. Right now, we don't have the technology to be able to pick out precisely the young leaves only. So that's why we need to have people go into the tea farms and pick out the young leaves one by one. And that's why we have these pictures of, aunties going into the fields and picking out tea leaves one by one. That's very important. And those are the people who pick out the, tippy top, very expensive Japanese green tea. Now, you might not see this as indicators too often in packages. They don't say that too often. But if you're looking at a very high-end Japanese tea, Japanese green tea that, like, for instance, the ones that we have in our shop as well, those would be hand-picked. The fourth indicator I'd like to talk about are the cultivars. So the tea plant, they're all the same. They're all the same Camellia sinensis tea plant. But under that family, there's lots of different types of cultivars. And depending on the cultivars, they would have different characteristics. So some might have a high umami, some might have a low umami, some might have different flavors, so on and so forth. So by far, the most famous cultivar in Japan is called the Yabukita cultivar. And this is about 60% to 70% of the total yield of Japanese tea, which is a huge dominating percentage. The reason why this is such a huge dominating percentage is because it's a very strong tea plant. It's easy to grow. It has a high yield. So economically, it really makes sense from a tea farm's perspective. However, in terms of taste, well, taste is actually not bad. It's a really good balanced tea. However, if you compare that to a more rare cultivar that's known for its umami, for example, an asatsuyu cultivar might be that it's called the natural gokuro because it has such a high natural umami. If you compare it to that, it's not as high in terms of umami. So you can see that depending on the different types of cultivars, you'll have different types of umami. And again, you won't see this too often as an indication in your bag of tea, especially because usually what happens is the tea masters will blend the different types of tea to try to achieve a balanced taste as much as possible. And that's considered to be the best practice in Japanese tea. However, these days you sometimes find single origins, single cultivar tea leaves. And if you find that, then you can see that they will indicate the types of cultivars, and that could be an indication of whether it might have high umami or not. So this is about it for this video. I hope you enjoy this, and we'll be making more videos, so I hope you stick around. If you want to know a little bit more about how Japanese tea is so healthy, then grab a cup of Japanese tea and click on the next link.